The most powerful man in Europe, ruler of an empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, is kneeling in sackcloth and ashes before a crowd of bishops, begging forgiveness. He didn't lose a war. He wasn't captured by enemies. He chose to do this, and it destroyed him. The question isn't why he did it. It's why the very philosophy of kingship he championed guaranteed this outcome. To understand why Europe's most powerful ruler was on his knees, start with how he got the throne. Charlemagne's 806 plan, the Divisio, Regnorum, or division of the kingdoms, would have split the empire among three sons. Then Pepin died in 810. Charles died in 811. By the time Charlemagne died in 814, only Louis remained. He inherited everything, not by design, but by biological accident. This matters. It gave Louis something Charlemagne never intended, a unified empire to theorize about. And Louis was no mere inheritor. He'd governed Aquitaine competently for decades, conquered Barcelona, and was more educated and theologically serious than his father. Louis pushed sacred kingship further than anyone before him. Sacred kingship, the idea that political authority isn't just blessed by God, but is itself a religious function, making the ruler spiritually responsible for every soul in the realm. Under Louis, the empire wasn't merely allied with the church, it was a religious entity. The emperor was personally accountable before God for his people's salvation. This created a fatal ambiguity. If the state is sacred, then the institution that defines what sacred means, the church, holds a trump card over the emperor who merely governs. And the logic doesn't stop there. Once the church can define the sacred, it can judge whether the emperor meets the standard. Once it can judge, it can discipline. Once it can discipline, its power grows and the cycle accelerates. Louis built this framework with deep conviction. He never saw the trap. His vision of sacred unity demanded a succession plan to match. Charlemagne's 806 plan would have simply divided the empire into three equal, independent kingdoms, one per son. Louis rejected that approach. In 817, he issued the Ordinatio Imperii, literally ordering of the empire, a formal plan for how the empire would be governed and inherited. His eldest son Lothar became co-emperor over the heartlands. Pepin received Aquitaine. Louis the German received Bavaria, both subordinate to Lothar. This wasn't just dividing land. It was an assertion that the empire must remain one sacred entity, unified under hierarchical authority, an elegant design. With one glaring vulnerability, it assumed no new heirs would arrive. And then Louis's conscience tore it apart. In 817, the same year as the Ordinatio, Louis's nephew Bernard of Italy rebelled, fearing the plan would strip his inheritance. Bernard was captured and sentenced to blinding, presented as the humane alternative to execution, since it rendered a man unfit to rule without killing him. Bernard died from the procedure. By 822, Louis' guilt consumed him. At Attigny, before assembled bishops, he performed full public penance, sackcloth ashes, formal confession. Public penance wasn't just apologizing. In medieval Christianity, it was a ritual submission to spiritual authority reserved for the gravest sins. Louis' remorse was genuine, and the political fallout was catastrophic. And the bishops witnessed their emperor submit to their judgment. They remembered, and they drew conclusions. A precedent now existed. The church could hold the emperor to spiritual account. Royal prestige cracked. 7 years later, a pope drew the logical conclusion. In 829, Pope Gregory IV made the argument explicit. His words, "Is not the authority over souls which belongs to the Pope above the imperial rule which is of this world?" The philosophical foundation was Platonic. Spirit is superior to matter because matter is mortal and spirit is eternal. In the medieval worldview, almost no one disputed this hierarchy in the abstract. Gregory's move was to collapse the distance between metaphysics and politics. If spirit rules matter, then the Pope, who governs souls, outranks the Emperor, who governs bodies, and here's what made this devastating for Louis specifically. His own ideology had made it nearly impossible to argue otherwise. Right? He declared the empire a sacred entity. He'd submitted to spiritual discipline. He'd built every plank of the platform Gregory now stood on. Meanwhile, the Ordinatio faced a threat Louis hadn't anticipated. In 825, his second wife, Judith, bore a son, Charles, later known as Charles the Bold. Judith pressured Louis to carve out a kingdom for Charles, which meant renegotiating the document that was supposed to guarantee permanent stability. The older sons, Lothar, Pepin, and Louis the German, saw this as betrayal. A council at Paris in 829 gave Charles a share, but the bishops simultaneously claimed the right to evaluate the king's performance. Rebellions erupted. Louis' sons fought among themselves but united against their father. In 833, at the Field of Lies, Louis was captured and forced to abdicate. He was restored in 834 only when Lothar overplayed his hand and alienated his own allies. Most accounts blame Louis's personality. They're wrong. He was a capable administrator and military leader. He failed because the ideology he championed more zealously than anyone contained a fatal contradiction. Declare the empire a sacred entity. The church becomes its ultimate authority. Perform public penance. That proves the church can humble a king. Design succession around the principle of sacred unity. Any disruption, a new wife, a new son, becomes a crisis of cosmic proportions. Each step followed logically from the one before. The cycle Louis set in motion could only end one way. Louis died in 840. By 843, his son signed the Treaty of Verdun, partitioning the empire into 3 kingdoms: the rough ancestors of France, Germany, and the contested middle strip known as Lotharingia. The unified Christian empire survived as aspiration, but never again as reality under the Carolingians. The church's claim to judge secular rulers would echo for centuries through the investiture controversy, Canossa, and beyond. Louis the Pious didn't just lose an empire, he proved a principle: the more you sacralize political power, the more you empower those who define what's sacred,